Frank Castellano had been turning wrenches longer than most people had been breathing. 67 years old, with hands that bore the permanent stains of 40 years spent coaxing life back into dead engines, he opened Castellano's Auto Repair every morning at 6 sharp, just as he had since 1983, when he'd bought the narrow garage bay on Maple Street, with money saved from a decade of working nights at the Ford plant. The shop wasn't much to look at, a single bay garage with concrete floors, polished smooth by decades of foot traffic, pegboard walls lined with tools that Frank could identify by touch in complete darkness, and a small office area where a coffee pot older than most of the neighborhood kids provided fuel for conversations that solved more problems than just automotive ones. But Frank's Auto Repair had become something more than a business over 4 decades of serving the same neighborhood. It had evolved into an institution, a gathering place, a classroom, and sometimes a sanctuary for people who needed more than mechanical expertise. They needed someone who understood that fixing things was about more than restoring functionality. Frank had a reputation that extended well beyond his mechanical skills, though those skills were considerable. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, identify transmission issues by feel, and spot suspension problems from across the street. He'd never met a car he couldn't fix, given enough time and the right parts, and he'd never charged more than a fair price for work that was always done right the first time. But Frank's real genius lay in his understanding that most people who brought their cars to his shop were dealing with more than mechanical problems. They were often struggling financially, worried about reliability, frustrated by previous bad experiences with repair shops, or simply overwhelmed by the complexity of modern automotive technology. Frank had learned to read people as accurately as he read diagnostic codes, and he'd developed an approach to customer service that treated each repair job as an opportunity to teach, to reassure, and to provide the kind of honest guidance that had become rare in an industry known more for exploitation than education. "Mrs. Patterson," Frank would say to the retired teacher who brought her 15-year-old Honda Civic in for regular maintenance, "that transmission's got another 100,000 miles in it if you keep up with the fluid changes. Don't let anybody tell you different." "Tommy," Frank would tell the college student whose beat-up Corolla was held together by determination and prayer, "that brake job can wait another month if you're careful, but those tires can't wait another week. Safety first, everything else second." "Maria," Frank would explain to the single mother whose minivan was her lifeline to work and her children's activities, "I'm going to show you how to check the oil yourself, and I want you to bring Rosa with you next time so she can learn too. Every woman should know how to take care of her car." Frank's shop had become the automotive equivalent of a family doctor's practice. Customers didn't just bring their cars to him, they brought their concerns, their questions, and their trust. Frank had delivered bad news about terminal engine problems with the same gentle honesty that he'd used to reassure worried parents that their teenagers' first cars were safe and reliable, despite surface imperfections. Over the years, Frank had taught 3 generations of neighborhood kids how to change oil, check tire pressure, and recognize the warning signs of common automotive problems. He'd hired dozens of high school students as part-time helpers, teaching them not just mechanical skills but work ethic, problem-solving, and customer service skills that served them well, regardless of what careers they eventually chose. Frank's shop had also become an informal community center where neighbors gathered to share coffee, discuss local issues, and seek advice about everything from automotive problems to family concerns. Frank had a gift for listening without judgment and offering practical wisdom without presuming to solve problems that were beyond his expertise. But on this particular Monday morning in October, as Frank unlocked the shop door and prepared for what he expected to be a routine day of brake jobs and tune-ups, he was carrying knowledge that would change everything about the informal community that had grown up around his garage over 4 decades. Frank Castellano was retiring. At the end of November, he would close Castellano's Auto Repair permanently, selling the building to a developer who planned to convert it into a trendy coffee shop that would serve expensive drinks to people who had never learned the satisfaction that came from fixing things with their own hands. Frank hadn't told anyone yet about his retirement plans, but he would have to start that difficult process today, beginning with the customers who had become like family and extending to the neighborhood that had supported his business for 40 years. Frank made coffee in the ancient pot that had served the shop since Reagan was president, arranged his tools with the precise attention to detail that had characterized his work for 4 decades, and prepared to begin the hardest conversation he'd ever had to have with the community that had become inseparable from his understanding of what it meant to do work that mattered. 40 years of teaching, more than mechanics. Frank's first customer of what would eventually become his last month in business was Jenny Morrison, a nurse at the county hospital whose 12-year-old Subaru Outback had been making concerning noises during her morning commute. "Frank," Jenny said as she pulled into the shop bay, "it's making that grinding sound again, but only when I turn left. And before you ask, yes, I've been keeping up with the oil changes like you taught me." Frank smiled at Jenny's preemptive answer to his standard first question. Over the 8 years that Jenny had been bringing her cars to him, Frank had trained her to anticipate the basic diagnostic information he would need, turning their interactions into collaborative problem-solving sessions rather than one-sided automotive lectures. Frank listened to the grinding sound as Jenny demonstrated the problem, his experienced ear immediately identifying the worn wheel bearing that was causing the noise. It was a straightforward repair that would take about 2 hours and cost Jenny roughly $300 in parts and labor. But Frank also knew that Jenny was supporting her elderly mother while paying off nursing school loans, and that $300 represented a significant expense that would require careful budgeting and possibly delayed payments on other bills. "Jenny," Frank said after completing his diagnosis, "that wheel bearing needs to be replaced. Soon, but it's not dangerous if you're careful about avoiding sharp left turns at high speed. I can order the part and have it ready by Friday if you want to wait until after payday." Jenny's relief was visible. "Frank, you always know exactly what I need to hear. Friday would be perfect." Frank made a note in his scheduling book, but he also made a mental note that this conversation would be one of many he would need to have with customers who had come to depend not just on his mechanical expertise, but on his understanding of their personal circumstances and his willingness to work with their financial limitations. Frank's approach to customer service had been shaped by his own experience growing up in a working-class family, where automotive problems were financial crises rather than minor inconveniences. Frank's father had been a factory worker who taught Frank to maintain cars with religious dedication because replacement wasn't an economic option. "Son," Frank's father had told him during childhood lessons conducted in their backyard garage, "rich people replace things when they break. Working people fix things and make them last. Learn to fix things, and you'll never be helpless." Frank had carried this philosophy into his professional life, treating each repair job as an opportunity to teach customers how to extend the life of their vehicles through proper maintenance, early problem identification, and realistic expectations about automotive longevity. But Frank had also developed a deeper understanding of his role in the community over 4 decades of observing how automotive problems affected people's lives. A reliable car meant the difference between keeping a job and losing it. Affordable repairs meant the difference between financial stability and crisis. Honest diagnostic advice meant the difference between informed decision-making and exploitation by unscrupulous repair shops. Frank had seen too many people taken advantage of by mechanics who recommended unnecessary repairs, charged inflated prices, or performed substandard work that created more problems than it solved. Frank had built his reputation on being the antidote to these practices, the mechanic who charged fairly, recommended only necessary work, and stood behind every repair with his personal guarantee. This reputation had made Frank's shop successful in ways that extended beyond financial metrics. Castellanos Auto Repair had the highest customer retention rate of any automotive business in the county, with 3 generations of the same families bringing their cars to Frank for maintenance and repair. Frank had also developed a network of other honest service providers, tire shops, parts suppliers, body repair specialists, who shared his commitment to fair dealing and quality work. Frank's recommendations carried enough weight in the community that other businesses competed for his endorsement rather than trying to undercut his prices. But Frank's real legacy wasn't measured in customer satisfaction scores or financial success. It was measured in the hundreds of young people he'd taught basic automotive skills, the countless customers he'd educated about proper vehicle maintenance, and the community trust he'd built through decades of consistent honesty and reliable expertise. As Frank worked on routine maintenance tasks throughout the morning, oil changes, tire rotations, brake inspections. He reflected on the 40 years of relationships he'd built through the simple practice of treating every customer's automotive problems as if they were his own family's concerns. Frank had learned the names of his customers' children, celebrated their graduations and weddings, offered condolences during difficult times, and provided not just automotive expertise, but practical life advice earned through decades of observing how people navigated challenges, both mechanical and personal. Frank had also learned that fixing cars was about more than restoring mechanical function. It was about providing reliability in people's lives, enabling independence and mobility, and demonstrating that problems could be solved through patient diagnosis, proper tools, and willingness to invest time and attention in work that others might consider routine. As the morning progressed and Frank served customers who had been bringing their cars to him for decades, he began to understand the magnitude of what he was about to lose and what the community was about to lose. When he closed Castellanos Auto Repair at the end of November, Frank had assumed that his retirement would be a personal transition that would affect primarily himself and his immediate family. He was beginning to realize that closing his shop would create a void in the community that would be difficult to fill with other automotive service providers who didn't share his commitment to education, fair dealing, and treatment of customers as extended family members. The announcement that changed everything. Frank decided to tell his customers about his retirement individually, rather than posting a general announcement, because he wanted to have personal conversations about how each person's automotive service needs would be handled after Castellanos Auto Repair closed. His first official retirement announcement came Tuesday afternoon when Margaret Chen brought her Toyota Camry in for routine maintenance that had kept the car reliable for the past 16 years. "Margaret," Frank said as he completed the oil change that had become a monthly ritual, "I need to tell you something important. I'm retiring at the end of November. This shop is going to close permanently." Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked at Frank with the expression of someone processing news that was both unexpected and personally significant. "Frank, you can't retire. What am I supposed to do with my car?" Frank had anticipated this reaction from Margaret, who had been bringing her cars to him since 1987 and had never used any other mechanic for automotive service. Margaret was 83 years old, lived on a fixed income, and depended on her Camry for transportation to medical appointments, grocery shopping, and the social activities that kept her connected to the community. "Margaret, I'm going to help you find another shop that will take good care of you and your Camry. I know several honest mechanics in the area, and I'll make sure they understand your car's maintenance history." But Margaret wasn't concerned about finding another mechanic. She was concerned about losing the relationship she'd built with Frank over 36 years of automotive service that had extended far beyond mechanical repairs. Frank had taught Margaret basic car maintenance skills that had saved her hundreds of dollars over the years. Frank had recommended reliable used cars when Margaret needed replacements, negotiating fair prices with dealers who respected his reputation. Frank had provided emergency roadside assistance, flexible payment terms, and automotive advice that had enabled Margaret to maintain independence despite the financial limitations of living on Social Security. More importantly, Frank had treated Margaret with the respect and consideration that she sometimes felt was missing from her interactions with service providers who assumed that elderly customers were easy targets for overcharging or unnecessary work. "Frank," Margaret said, "you've been taking care of my cars longer than some people have been alive. I trust you completely. I don't know how to start over with a new mechanic at my age." Frank understood Margaret's concern because he'd heard similar sentiments from dozens of customers over the past week as he'd begun the process of announcing his retirement. For many of his longtime customers, Castellanos Auto Repair wasn't just an automotive service provider. It was their connection to reliable, honest, affordable car care that had enabled them to maintain mobility and independence despite financial constraints or advancing age. "Margaret, I'm not going to abandon you," Frank promised. "I'll introduce you personally to Tom Rodriguez at Rodriguez Motors. He's been in business for 15 years, he's completely honest, and he understands that taking good care of customers is more important than maximizing profits. I'll make sure he has your car's complete maintenance history, and I'll vouch for you personally." Margaret nodded, but Frank could see that she was still processing the emotional impact of losing a relationship that had provided not just automotive service, but also continuity, reliability, and personal connection that had become increasingly rare in her experience with other businesses. Frank spent the rest of the week having similar conversations with customers who had built relationships with him that extended well beyond routine automotive transactions. Each conversation reinforced Frank's growing understanding that his retirement would affect the community in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. By Friday, word about Frank's retirement was spreading through the neighborhood informal communication networks that connected longtime residents who had watched Castellanos Auto Repair evolve from a struggling new business into a community institution. Frank received phone calls from customers he hadn't seen in months, former employees who wanted to express gratitude for the skills and work ethic they'd learned at his shop, and neighbors who had never been customers but who recognized that Frank's retirement represented the loss of something valuable to the community's character and cohesion. The phone calls were followed by visits from people who wanted to express their appreciation for Frank's 40 years of service, and to ask whether there was anything they could do to convince him to postpone his retirement. "Frank," said David Kim, whose family had been bringing their cars to Castellanos Auto Repair for 23 years, "the neighborhood won't be the same without your shop. You've been more than a mechanic. You've been like the neighborhood's automotive guardian angel." Frank appreciated the sentiment, but he also knew that retirement was the right decision for him personally and financially. At 67, Frank was experiencing the normal physical limitations that come with 4 decades of work that required lifting heavy parts, working in awkward positions, and spending long hours on concrete floors that were unforgiving to aging joints and muscles. Frank had also reached the point where keeping up with rapid changes in automotive technology was becoming more challenging and more expensive. Modern cars required diagnostic equipment that cost more than Frank had originally paid for his entire shop setup, and learning to repair hybrid and electric vehicles would require training investments that didn't make economic sense for someone planning to retire within 5 years. But the community response to news of his retirement was making Frank realize that Castellanos Auto Repair had served purposes that extended beyond automotive service, and that closing the shop would create needs that wouldn't be addressed by simply referring customers to other mechanical repair businesses. Frank was contemplating the broader implications of his retirement when he received a visit that would change his understanding of what legacy meant and what responsibilities came with 4 decades of community service that had affected multiple generations of neighborhood residents. When the neighborhood rallied together, the visit came on a Saturday morning when Frank was catching up on bookkeeping and preparing estimates for customers who needed major repairs. Frank heard a car door slam in the alley behind his shop, followed by footsteps that sounded like someone approaching with determination rather than routine automotive concerns. Frank looked up to see Sofia Morales walking into his shop. Sofia was 8 years old, the daughter of Carmen Morales, who had been bringing her family's cars to Frank for 12 years. Sofia had been accompanying her mother to the shop since she was old enough to sit safely in automotive waiting areas, and Frank had watched her grow from a curious toddler who asked endless questions about how cars worked into a mechanically inclined kid who could identify basic tools and understood simple automotive maintenance procedures. "Mr. Frank," Sofia said with the seriousness that children bring to important conversations, "Mama sent me to ask you something very important." Frank set down his paperwork and gave Sofia his complete attention, because he'd learned that children's questions often cut straight to the heart of issues that adults approached with unnecessary complexity. "What's your important question, Sofia?" "Mama says you're closing your shop and we won't be able to bring our cars here anymore. But I don't understand why you have to close it. Can't someone else learn to fix cars the way you do?" Frank looked at Sofia's earnest expression and realized that she was asking the question that several adults had hinted at but hadn't asked directly: whether Frank's retirement had to mean the permanent closure of the automotive expertise and customer service approach that had made Castellanos Auto Repair important to the community. "Sofia, fixing cars takes a long time to learn. It's not something you can teach someone in a few weeks or even a few months. It takes years to learn how to diagnose problems correctly and fix them properly." Sofia considered this explanation with the logical approach she brought to most problems. "But Mr. Frank, you've been teaching people how to fix cars for a really long time. Mama says you taught her brother Roberto, and Roberto taught his son Miguel, and Miguel is really good at fixing cars now. Couldn't Miguel learn to run your shop?" Frank realized that Sofia was referring to a pattern of informal apprenticeship that had characterized his approach to hiring and training employees over 4 decades. Frank had indeed taught dozens of young people automotive skills, many of whom had gone on to successful careers in automotive service, manufacturing, or related fields. But Frank had never considered whether any of his former employees might be interested in purchasing Castellanos Auto Repair and continuing its operation under new ownership. Frank had assumed that his retirement would necessarily mean the shop's closure because he'd been so closely identified with its operation that he hadn't imagined it continuing without his direct involvement. Sophia, that's actually a very good question. Let me think about whether Miguel or any of the other people I've taught over the years might want to keep the shop running. Sophia nodded with satisfaction at having contributed a potentially useful idea to the adult conversation about Mr. Frank's retirement. Mama also wanted me to tell you that she's organizing a neighborhood meeting about your shop. She wants everyone to come and talk about what we can do to keep it open. Frank was surprised by news of a neighborhood meeting. Carmen Morales was a natural organizer who had coordinated school fundraisers and community events, but Frank hadn't expected her to treat his retirement as a community issue that required collective response. When is this meeting, Sophia? Tomorrow afternoon at the community center. Mama called everybody she could think of and she asked me to give you this invitation. Sophia handed Frank a handwritten invitation that had been prepared with the care that children bring to important documents. The invitation, written in Sophia's careful script, read, "Please come to a meeting about Mr. Frank's shop tomorrow at 2 p.m. We need to talk about how to keep the shop open because everyone needs a place to get their cars fixed by someone who cares about doing good work." Frank looked at the invitation and realized that Sophia and Carmen had captured the essence of why Castellanos Auto Repair had become important to the community. It wasn't just an automotive service provider. It was a place where people could get their cars fixed by someone who cared about doing good work and treating customers fairly. Frank also realized that he had been thinking about his retirement from his own perspective, as a personal decision about when to end his working career, without fully considering the community's perspective on losing a resource that had served multiple generations of neighborhood families. Frank thanked Sophia for delivering the invitation and promised that he would attend the meeting, though he cautioned that he couldn't make any commitments about changing his retirement plans. After Sophia left, Frank spent the rest of the morning thinking about the questions she had raised and the community response that Carmen was organizing. Frank began to understand that his retirement wasn't just a personal transition. It was a community event that would affect dozens of families who had come to depend on the automotive service and customer relationships that Castellanos Auto Repair had provided for 4 decades. Frank also began to consider possibilities he hadn't previously explored, whether the shop could continue under new ownership, whether his informal apprenticeship approach had prepared anyone to carry forward his commitment to honest dealing and quality work, and whether his retirement could become a transition that preserved the community resource rather than eliminating it. Frank was considering these possibilities when he remembered Miguel Santos, who had worked for him part-time during high school and summers during college, and who had recently completed certification as an automotive technician at the community college. Miguel had grown up in the neighborhood, learned his initial automotive skills at Castellanos Auto Repair, and had expressed interest in eventually opening his own shop. Frank reached for his phone to call Miguel, wondering if Sunday's neighborhood meeting might produce solutions that would serve both Frank's need to retire and the community's need to preserve access to honest, affordable automotive service. The young apprentice who carried forward. Miguel Santos answered his phone on the second ring, sounding pleased to hear from Frank even though it had been 6 months since they'd spoken regularly. Miguel was 26 years old, recently certified as a master automotive technician, and currently working at a chain automotive service center where his skills were underutilized and his customer service instincts were constrained by corporate policies focused on sales volume rather than customer satisfaction. "Mr. Castellano," Miguel said, using the formal address he'd maintained since his teenage years working at Frank's shop. "How are you? I've been meaning to stop by and see how things are going." Frank explained his retirement plans and the community response that had culminated in Sophia's invitation to Sunday's neighborhood meeting. Frank also explained the questions that Sophia had raised about whether the shop could continue under different ownership. "Miguel, I know you're working at AutoZone Service Center now, but I remember that you always talked about wanting to run your own shop someday. Would you have any interest in taking over Castellano's Auto Repair. The phone was quiet for several seconds while Miguel processed the unexpected opportunity that Frank was presenting. Miguel had indeed dreamed of owning his own automotive repair business, but he'd assumed that would require years of saving money, finding suitable location, building customer base, and establishing the kind of community trust that took decades to develop. Mr. Castellano, I would love to take over your shop, but I don't know if I have the experience or the money to do it right. Your customers trust you because you've been taking care of their cars for 40 years. Why would they trust me? Frank had anticipated Miguel's concerns about experience and credibility, because Frank remembered having similar doubts when he'd first opened Castellano's Auto Repair in 1983. But Frank also remembered the advantages that Miguel brought to the opportunity: technical skills that were superior to Frank's at the same age, customer service instincts that had been shaped by Frank's mentorship, and community connections that had been developing since childhood. Miguel, you learned automotive skills here, but more importantly, you learned how to treat customers with respect and honesty. You understand that fixing cars is about more than just mechanical repair. It's about providing reliable service to people who depend on their vehicles for transportation to work, family obligations, and community activities. Frank paused, remembering the teenager who had approached automotive problems with intelligence, curiosity, and genuine concern for helping customers rather than maximizing profits. Miguel, I would be willing to work with you on a transition that would give you time to establish yourself with existing customers and develop the financial stability to purchase the business. I'm not looking to maximize the sale price. I'm looking to ensure that the neighborhood continues to have access to honest automotive service. Miguel was quiet again, calculating the practical implications of taking over an established automotive repair business with 40 years of customer relationships, community trust, and reputation for quality work. Mr. Castellano, what would you need from me to make this work? I mean, what would the transition look like? Frank had been considering transition possibilities since his conversation with Sophia, and he'd developed ideas about how to structure a handover that would serve both his retirement needs and the community's need for continuity in automotive service. Miguel, I would propose a 6-month transition period where you work alongside me, getting reacquainted with existing customers and learning the administrative aspects of running the business. During that time, you could establish financing for purchasing the business, and I could provide recommendations to customers about your skills and commitment to honest service. Frank continued outlining his vision for a transition that would preserve the community relationships and service philosophy that had made Castellano's Auto Repair successful, while giving Miguel time to establish his own leadership of the business. Miguel, I would also be willing to stay involved as a consultant for the first year, helping with major diagnostic problems and providing backup during busy periods. I'm retiring from full-time work, but I'm not ready to stop working entirely. Miguel's enthusiasm was evident in his voice as he responded to Frank's offer. Mr. Castellano, this would be incredible. I've been unhappy at AutoZone because they push us to recommend unnecessary services and sell products that customers don't need. I want to run a shop the way you've always run yours, focused on honest diagnosis, fair pricing, and quality work. Frank smiled, hearing in Miguel's response the values that he'd tried to model during Miguel's apprenticeship and that had apparently taken root despite several years of working in a corporate, automotive service environment that prioritized sales over service. Miguel, why don't you come to tomorrow's community meeting? The neighbors want to discuss ways to keep the shop open, and your presence would demonstrate that there's a realistic possibility for continuing the business under new ownership. After ending his call with Miguel, Frank spent the rest of Saturday reflecting on the unexpected direction that his retirement planning had taken. Frank had expected to spend his final weeks gradually winding down the business, completing final repairs for longtime customers, and preparing for a retirement focused on personal interests and family time. Instead, Frank was discovering that his retirement could become a transition that preserved the community resource while launching Miguel's career as an independent automotive service provider. Frank was also discovering that the community investment in Castellano's Auto Repair extended far beyond the customer relationships he had recognized and valued. Frank was beginning to understand that 40 years of honest service had created something larger than a successful small business. It had created a model of how work could serve community needs while providing personal satisfaction and financial stability. Frank looked forward to Sunday's meeting with curiosity, about what other community perspectives he would discover about the role that Castellanos Auto Repair had played in neighborhood life over 4 decades. Lessons that went beyond engine repair. The community meeting drew larger attendance than Carmen Morales had expected when she'd organized it as a forum for discussing Frank's retirement. The community center's main room was filled with families who had used Castellanos Auto Repair over 4 decades, former employees who had learned skills that had shaped their careers, and neighbors who had never been customers but who recognized Frank's shop as an important community institution. Carmen opened the meeting by explaining that the purpose was to explore options for keeping automotive service available in the neighborhood after Frank's retirement, and to express community appreciation for 40 years of honest business practices that had served multiple generations of local families. Frank has been more than a mechanic, Carmen said, addressing the assembled crowd. He's been a teacher, a mentor, and an example of how to run a business with integrity. We're here to discuss how we can preserve what Frank has built and support a transition that serves both Frank's retirement needs and the community's ongoing automotive service needs. Frank was invited to speak first, and he used the opportunity to explain his retirement timeline, his conversation with Miguel Santos about potentially taking over the business, and his willingness to structure a transition that would preserve customer relationships and service quality. I never expected my retirement to become a community issue, Frank said, but I'm learning that this shop has meant more to people than I realized. If we can find a way to continue the business under new ownership while maintaining the service philosophy and customer relationships that have made it successful, I'm willing to work with that transition. Miguel was invited to introduce himself and explain his background, his current employment situation, and his interest in taking over Castellanos Auto Repair. Miguel's presentation was well received by community members who remembered him from his teenage years working at Frank's shop, and who appreciated his obvious commitment to continuing Frank's approach to customer service. But the most revealing part of the meeting came when community members were invited to share their experiences with Castellanos Auto Repair and explain why Frank's retirement represented more than just the loss of a convenient automotive service provider. Margaret Chen spoke first, describing how Frank had helped her maintain automotive independence despite the financial constraints of living on Social Security and the challenges of navigating an automotive service industry that often treated elderly customers with condescension or dishonesty. Frank taught me how to check my own oil, how to recognize warning signs of common problems, and how to avoid being taken advantage of by unscrupulous repair shops, Margaret said. More importantly, Frank treated me with respect and explained automotive issues in terms I could understand. I never felt stupid or helpless when I brought my car to Frank's shop. David Kim described how Frank had helped his family navigate automotive problems during periods of financial difficulty, providing flexible payment terms, priority service during emergencies, and honest assessments of whether expensive repairs were worth making on older vehicles. Frank could have made a lot more money over the years by recommending unnecessary repairs or charging premium prices, David said. Instead, he built long-term relationships with customers who trusted him completely because he always put our interests ahead of his short-term profits. Jenny Morrison, the nurse whose wheel-bearing Frank had diagnosed earlier in the week, described how Frank's automotive education had enabled her to avoid costly problems through proper maintenance and early problem identification. Frank didn't just fix my car when problems occurred, Jenny said. He taught me how to prevent problems from occurring in the first place, and he gave me the confidence to discuss automotive issues with other service providers without feeling vulnerable to exploitation. But the most powerful testimony came from Roberto Morales, Carmen's brother, who had worked for Frank during the 1990s and had used the skills and work ethic he'd learned at Castellanos Auto Repair to build a successful career as a manufacturing supervisor. Frank taught me more than automotive repair, Roberto said. He taught me how to approach problems methodically, how to communicate with people respectfully, how to take pride in quality work, and how to build trust through consistent, honest dealing. Those skills have been valuable in every job I've had since leaving Frank's shop. Roberto's testimony was followed by similar comments from other former employees who credited Frank with teaching them skills and values that had influenced their careers and their approach to work relationships. Frank listened to these testimonials with growing understanding of how his approach to business had affected people in ways that extended far beyond automotive service. Frank had focused on providing honest, reliable car repair, but he had inadvertently created a model of ethical business practices, practical education, and community service that had influenced dozens of people over 4 decades. The meeting concluded with community members expressing support for Miguel's transition to ownership and offering various forms of assistance: customer commitments, word-of-mouth marketing, referrals to other potential customers, and even financial support for business transition costs. Frank left the meeting with a clearer understanding of what legacy meant and why his retirement had become a community issue rather than a personal decision. Frank also left with commitment to work with Miguel on a transition plan that would preserve the community resource while honoring 40 years of customer relationships built on trust, honesty, and dedication to quality work. The community that refused to let go. Over the following 2 weeks, Frank and Miguel worked together to develop a transition plan that addressed the practical, financial, and relational aspects of transferring ownership of Castellanos Auto Repair. The plan they developed was more complex than a simple business sale because it aimed to preserve the community relationships and service philosophy that had made the shop successful over 4 decades. The financial arrangement was structured as a rent-to-own agreement that would allow Miguel to take over daily operations immediately, while gradually purchasing the business assets over 3 years. Frank would retain ownership of the building while Miguel assumed responsibility for equipment, inventory, and customer relationships. More importantly, Frank would continue working part-time for 6 months, introducing Miguel to longtime customers, sharing diagnostic expertise and business practices, and providing the credibility transfer that would enable customers to trust Miguel with the same confidence they had placed in Frank. The transition plan also included provisions for Frank to remain available as a consultant for major diagnostic problems, emergency situations, and technical challenges that exceeded Miguel's current expertise. Frank would gradually reduce his involvement as Miguel gained experience and confidence, but the community would have continuity of service during the transition period. Frank and Miguel announced their partnership in a letter that was mailed to all existing customers, explaining the transition timeline, introducing Miguel's background and qualifications, and emphasizing the commitment to maintaining the service quality and customer relationships that had characterized Castellanos Auto Repair under Frank's ownership. The customer response to the transition announcement was overwhelmingly positive. Phone calls and personal visits expressed support for Miguel, appreciation for Frank's decision to structure a transition rather than simply closing the business, and relief that the neighborhood would retain access to honest automotive service. Margaret Chen was among the first customers to schedule an appointment with Miguel, bringing her Toyota Camry for routine maintenance that would allow her to evaluate Miguel's technical skills and customer service approach. Miguel, Margaret said after Miguel completed the oil change and multi-point inspection that Frank had been performing monthly for 16 years. "You have the same gentle way with customers that Frank has. I can tell you learned from the best teacher." Miguel appreciated Margaret's endorsement, but he also understood that earning customer trust would require consistent demonstration of the technical skills and honest dealing that customers had come to expect from Castellanos Auto Repair. Over the next month, Miguel worked alongside Frank to serve customers who wanted to observe the transition firsthand and evaluate whether the shop would maintain its reputation for quality work and fair dealing under new ownership. The evaluation period went smoothly, with customers consistently expressing satisfaction with Miguel's technical skills, diagnostic accuracy, and customer communication. Miguel demonstrated that he had indeed absorbed Frank's approach to customer service, treating each repair job as an opportunity to educate customers and build long-term relationships rather than maximize short-term profits. But the real test of Miguel's readiness to take over the business came when Sofia Morales brought her family's minivan to the shop with a complex engine problem that required advanced diagnostic skills and careful customer communication about expensive repair options. Miguel diagnosed the problem as a failed timing chain that would require significant engine disassembly and approximately $1,500 in parts and labor. The repair was economically justified given the vehicle's age and condition, but it represented a major expense for a family that had been managing automotive costs carefully. Miguel explained the diagnosis to Carmen Morales, with the same patience and clarity that Frank had always used for complex technical explanations, detailing what had failed, why the failure had occurred, what repair options were available, and what the long-term prognosis would be for the vehicle after the repair was completed. "Miguel," Carmen said after reviewing the repair estimate, "I trust your diagnosis because Frank trained you and because you're taking time to explain everything clearly. But $1,500 is a lot of money for us. Is there any way to make this repair more affordable?" Miguel had anticipated this question, and he'd discussed repair financing options with Frank during his transition training. Miguel offered Carmen a payment plan that would allow her to spread the repair cost over 3 months without interest charges, ensuring that her family's transportation needs could be met without creating financial hardship. Carmen accepted Miguel's payment plan and authorized the repair, expressing gratitude for the flexible payment terms and confidence in Miguel's technical abilities. Frank observed Miguel's handling of this complex repair situation with pride and satisfaction, recognizing that Miguel had demonstrated not just technical competence but the customer service instincts and business judgment that would enable him to continue serving the community according to the principles that had made Castellanos Auto Repair successful. After completing Carmen's timing chain repair, Frank announced that he was ready to transition to part-time consultation role, confident that Miguel was prepared to assume full responsibility for daily operations while maintaining the shop's reputation for honest dealing and quality work. Passing the wrench to the next generation, Frank's formal retirement from daily operations at Castellanos Auto Repair was marked by a neighborhood celebration that reflected the community's appreciation for 40 years of service and their confidence in Miguel's ability to continue the shop's tradition of honest automotive service. The celebration took place on a Saturday afternoon in November, with customers, former employees, and neighbors gathering in the shop bay that had been decorated with streamers and filled with tables of food contributed by community members who wanted to express gratitude for Frank's service and support for Miguel's new ownership. Sofia Morales, the 8-year-old who had originally suggested that someone else could learn to run Frank's shop, presented Frank with a handmade card signed by dozens of neighborhood children. The card thanked Frank for fixing our family's cars and teaching us that broken things can be made to work again. Margaret Chen presented Frank with a photo album containing pictures from 40 years of community events, customer interactions, and shop activities that documented Frank's integration into neighborhood life beyond his role as automotive service provider. Roberto Morales, speaking on behalf of former employees, thanked Frank for providing not just job training, but life lessons about work ethic, integrity, and customer service that had influenced their subsequent careers and personal relationships. But the most meaningful part of the celebration was the ceremonial transfer of Frank's personal tool set to Miguel, a collection of wrenches, diagnostic equipment, and specialized tools that represented 4 decades of automotive problem-solving and customer service. "Miguel," Frank said as he presented the tool set, "these tools have helped me serve this community for 40 years. They're not the most expensive tools or the newest tools, but they're reliable tools that have been maintained with care and used with respect for the work they enable." Frank continued his remarks by emphasizing the responsibility that came with inheriting not just automotive equipment, but community trust and customer relationships built over 4 decades. "Miguel, you're not just taking over a business. You're taking over relationships with people who have trusted this shop with their transportation needs for multiple generations. That trust has to be earned every day through honest diagnosis, fair pricing, and quality. Work that puts customer needs ahead of short-term profits." Miguel accepted Frank's tool set with the seriousness appropriate to receiving both practical equipment and symbolic responsibility for continuing a community tradition of ethical business practices. "Mr. Castellano," Miguel said, "I promise to use these tools and operate this shop according to the principles you've demonstrated for 40 years. I will treat every customer with respect, provide honest diagnostic advice, charge fair prices, and stand behind every repair with my personal guarantee." Miguel concluded his remarks by announcing that the shop would continue operating under the name Castellanos Auto Repair in honor of Frank's legacy and to maintain continuity for customers who had trusted that name for 4 decades. The celebration concluded with Frank and Miguel working together to complete a routine brake job on David Kim's sedan, demonstrating the seamless transition of skills and customer relationships. that would enable the shop to continue serving the community without interruption. As neighbors cleaned up from the celebration and returned to their Saturday evening activities, Frank reflected on the unexpected direction his retirement had taken and the community response that had transformed his personal career transition into a collaborative effort to preserve a neighborhood resource. Frank had learned that 40 years of honest work had created something larger than a successful small business. It had created a model of how individuals could serve community needs while building personal satisfaction and economic stability through dedication to quality work and ethical business practices. The legacy of honest work and caring hands. 6 months after Miguel took over daily operations at Castellanos Auto Repair, the shop was thriving under new ownership while maintaining the customer relationships and service philosophy that had made it successful under Frank's management. Miguel had proven himself capable of handling complex diagnostic problems, managing customer relationships with sensitivity and honesty, and operating the business according to principles that prioritized long-term customer satisfaction over short-term profit maximization. Frank continued to serve as occasional consultant for major repairs and diagnostic challenges, but his involvement had gradually decreased as Miguel gained confidence and customers developed trust in his abilities. Frank's retirement had evolved into the semi-retirement that he'd originally envisioned, staying connected to work he loved while having time for family activities and personal interests that had been neglected during 40 years of full-time business operation. The community had successfully preserved access to honest automotive service while enabling Frank to transition to retirement and Miguel to establish himself as an independent business owner. The transition had served everyone's interests while demonstrating how community involvement could influence business succession in ways that benefited all stakeholders. But the real measure of the transition's success wasn't found in business metrics or customer satisfaction surveys. It was found in the continuation of relationships, teaching opportunities, and community connections that had made Castellanos Auto Repair more than just an automotive service provider. Miguel had continued Frank's practice of hiring high school students as part-time employees, teaching them automotive skills and work habits that would serve them regardless of their eventual career choices. Miguel had also continued Frank's practice of providing automotive education to customers, helping them understand proper maintenance procedures and recognize early warning signs of common problems. Most importantly, Miguel had maintained Frank's commitment to treating customers as extended family members whose transportation needs deserved careful attention and whose financial circumstances required consideration when recommending repair options. Sofia Morales, now 9 years old and even more interested in automotive mechanics than she had been during Frank's retirement crisis, had become a regular visitor to the shop on Saturday mornings when Miguel offered informal automotive education sessions for neighborhood children. "Mr. Miguel," Sofia said during a recent Saturday morning session where she was learning to identify different types of automotive fluids, "when I grow up, I want to learn to fix cars like you and Mr. Frank. Will you teach me?" Miguel looked at Sofia's earnest expression and remembered his own childhood fascination with automotive technology and his gratitude for Frank's willingness to share knowledge and provide apprenticeship opportunities. "Sofia, if you're still interested in learning automotive repair when you're old enough to work here, I promise to teach you everything I know, just like Mr. Frank taught me." Sofia nodded with satisfaction, already planning a future that would continue the tradition of automotive education and community service that had characterized Castellanos Auto Repair for 40 years. Frank, who had observed this conversation from the corner of the shop where he was organizing inventory, smiled at the recognition that his legacy would extend beyond Miguel to include another generation of young people who would learn that fixing things was about more than mechanical repair. It was about serving community needs, building relationships, and demonstrating that honest work could provide both personal satisfaction and economic stability. Frank looked around the shop that had been his professional home for 40 years, and that was now Miguel's responsibility and Sofia's inspiration. The tools were the same, the customer relationships continued, and the commitment to honest service remained unchanged. But the shop was also evolving to serve new customers, address changing automotive technology, and provide opportunities for new generations of young people to learn skills and values that would influence their entire careers. Frank understood now that retirement wasn't about ending something. It was about ensuring that something valuable continued under new leadership while maintaining the principles and relationships that had made it important to the community. Frank Castellano, retired mechanic and occasional consultant, walked out of Castellano's auto repair on a Saturday evening carrying 40 years of satisfaction that came from work done well, relationships built on trust and community service that had influenced multiple generations of neighborhood families. Behind him, Miguel Santos was teaching Sofia Morales how to properly organize tools on a pegboard, continuing a tradition of automotive education that connected practical skills with community service and demonstrated that the best work was work that helped other people solve problems, maintain independence, and understand that broken things could be repaired by people who cared enough to learn how. The shop where Frank had spent 40 years fixing cars and building relationships would continue serving the community under new ownership, with the same commitment to honest diagnosis, fair pricing, and quality work that treated every customer's automotive problems as opportunities to provide reliable service to people who deserved respect, consideration, and the kind of helpful expertise that made independence possible and community connection stronger. Some legacies were measured in satisfied customers, successful repairs, and financial stability. But the best legacies were measured in relationships maintained, skills transferred, and values demonstrated through decades of consistent dedication to work that served purposes larger than personal profit and created connections that outlasted individual careers. Frank had built that kind of legacy, one wrench turn at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one satisfied customer at a time, over 40 years of showing up every morning, ready to fix whatever needed fixing and teach whoever needed learning. The neighborhood would remember